Look how sick this sweatshirt I made was. Tanya did the image. I made the font. Proteus Academy. This is the dopest merch of all time. There's only one of them. It's not for you. It's for me. Anyway, thank you, Tanya. This video is the Proteus Debate Dictionary. I've wanted to do this for a long time, and a student finally asked about it in the comments of a video. So now I'm doing it. Let's go. On God, there's like 60 slides. I've tried this like 3 times and keep finding mistakes. I'm just gonna roll with it no matter what at this point, folks. So, starting with basic debate terminology, this is basically things that are obviously very basic in level, but I couldn't really categorize effectively anywhere else, so I kind of just lumped them together. First things first, what is a resolution? A resolution is the topic to be debated in a debate round, right? So we have something that we have to debate. We have to have that because otherwise, how would both teams show up and be prepared? Second, we have criteria. A criteria is the system or lens the judge should evaluate the round through. So one example is net benefits. And when people say net benefits, what they mean is once we weigh up all the good and bad in the rounds from both sides, whichever team is most good should win the debate. And that's also potentially very similar to consequentialism. Fiat. Fiat is the act of imagining that a hypothetical advocacy was implemented. So obviously we can't literally make the USFG, the United States federal government, do something, but we can say, let's pretend that they did for the sake of argument. That's also Sasan likes to explain fiat. He says, like, for the sake of argument. Flowing. Flowing is the note-taking process in debate. It's generally done in columns. So you'll have a sheet of paper. I usually put it vertical rather than horizontal. And you'll draw 4 to 5 columns on it, and then you will flow speeches one after the other in it. The reason you do that is because when you take notes that way, it becomes very clear where dropped arguments have occurred. We'll talk about what a dropped argument is in just a minute. Dropped. A dropped means an argument has gone unresponded to. So you made an argument and the other team did not respond to it. The implication here is that the judge should assume that argument is true. This a kind of a weird incentive structure in debate where basically if you didn't assume dropped arguments are true, teams could just drop arguments and still later on respond to stuff. And given that someone gets the last speech, it could cause issues. Extension. An extension, or when someone extends an argument, is when a debater carries an argument through to a later speech. So I made an argument on my first speech. There was a speech by my opponent after that, and then I brought that argument up again later on because I did not want it to be dropped throughout the debate. There's this concept of a shadow extension, which we don't talk about a ton in this debate dictionary, but that's where, like, let's pretend you have 3 speeches. You talked about it in speech 1, you talked about it in speech 3, but it was not talked about in speech 2. That's illegitimate, in my opinion, and many judges' opinions. Let's now move on to section 1, stock issues and basics terminology. Really, it's mostly just stock issues at this point. Status quo. So status quo is the idea of the world as it exists before fiating and advocacy. And so that means when we have a plan in plan style debate, something we'll be defining shortly, we have to be able to say, well, yeah, there's the world of the plan where we pretend something happens, but what did the world look like before we pretended that happened so that we can tell whether a change has occurred that is meaningful? Stock issues. So what are stock issues? Stock issues are the minimum components required to affirm the topic/resolution. These are necessary but insufficient burdens. What does that mean? It means that you have to do certain things just to play the game, but you don't win the game because you did those things. It's like Monopoly, like do not pass go, do not collect $200 until you've satisfied these burdens, and we'll talk about what those burdens are in just a second, depending on the style of debate. Nothing else you do matters. Now, most debate formats have moved away from stock issues. This is very old hat at this point, but I just wanted to talk about it anyway. So, what are the stock issues of policy debate? Well, they are shipsat, and you can't see one of them very well, so I'll move my camera once we get to it. But we start with the significant harms. That is the problems that exist in the status quo. Then we move to inherency. That is the barrier to the harms being resolved in the status quo. And I want to be clear here, what we're saying is that the problems won't solve themselves. The harms won't solve themselves. The plan isn't just going to spontaneously occur on its own, so we need to pretend it will. And then that brings us to the plan. The plan is obviously the advocacy the affirmative team defends should be implemented. So there's a resolution that, in theory, says someone should do something, and the plan is where we specify what that something is. Let me move my camera now that we know what the plan is so that we can look at topicality. Solvency is how the plan solves the harms, right? So we've established there are harms, and we've established we're going to do something about it. Now we need to explain why the plan specifically fixes those problems. Advantage, and this is distinct from the concept of advantages, just for the record. It's also called comparative advantage, is demonstrating that the world of the plan is preferable to the status quo. Because obviously, if you just say we do something, but you don't explain why that's better than the status quo, we would presume for the status quo. We would have presumption for it. Topicality is the affirmative's burden to present a plan that supports the resolution. And so that means that when we're given a resolution that says something like the United States federal government should increase the minimum wage, you need to defend that the minimum wage increases in some way. It's insufficient to say something that would still solve the problem, but is not the minimum wage. For instance, you could establish like a universal basic income, or you could, I guess, I don't know, make all things free, get rid of money, but none of those are increasing the minimum wage, so they're not topical in that sense. Okay, let's see if we can sneak me down in the corner. I'm gonna be a little scrunched up, guys, but whatever. It's just more important that you see the definition because it's dictionary. So, inherency, there's technically 3 kinds of inherency, and so I wanted to discuss those for you folks. There is structural inherency, which is arguing that there are structural barriers such as legal agreements or laws that prevent the harms from being resolved in the status quo. So, like, maybe we have a treaty with this country, or maybe there's some law that says we can't do this thing, and that is the reason why we're not going to do it. Let me move the camera down, because I think, there we go. Perfect. Now I can stay scrunched, and it's just fine. That brings us to attitudinal inherency. Attitudinal inherency is arguing that there is not public or political support for the passing of a plan in the status quo. So Republicans don't want to do it. Democrats don't want to do it. Voters haven't supported this. That's why it hasn't happened. And then lastly, this one's garbage and you shouldn't use it, but I'm just going to tell you about it so you know it exists. That is existential inherency. Existential inherency is arguing that because harms exist, there must therefore be some barrier preventing the harms from being solved in the status quo. So basically it's saying, look, I don't know what's actually stopping this from happening, but it hasn't happened, so must be something. Now let's talk stock issues of value debate, because those were the stock issues of policy debate, as you presumably would have known from the title. In value debate, stock issues are a little bit different, and there's only really 2 things we need to talk about here, and that is value and value criterion. A value is the principle that a debater argues ought to be prioritized above all others when evaluating the round, and a value criterion is how the value ought to be operationalized in order to allow the judge to measure the otherwise abstract value. So the way I explain this to my students is, let's talk about athleticism, right? So we've said our highest value is athleticism, but athleticism is kind of abstract because it means a lot of things to a lot of people. And so a value criterion is where we answer, how do we measure athleticism? And we could agree that athleticism is the highest value, but one of us could think athleticism is best measured, best operationalized by measuring bench press, and one of us might think it's who can run the fastest, swim the furthest, etc. Number 2, we're going to do case structure terminology. So, positions. Advantage and disadvantage. So these are a position put forth to support the affirmative or negative side of a resolution, generally using the uniqueness model as its structure, typically used in policy/plan focused debate formats. We'll be talking about what the parts of the uniqueness model are in just a second in case you don't know what that means. Then in more value style debate, we have contention/counter contentions. These are a position put forth to support the affirmative or negative side of a resolution using contention structure, which is claim, warrant, implication. Again, we'll explain those in just a second. Generally used in value or fact debate. This probably mostly matters for, I guess, LDers, but definitely partly people. The uniqueness model terminology. So the uniqueness model has 4 parts. The first part is uniqueness. This is arguments which describe the status quo or predictions of what the status quo will look like independent of the affirmative's plan. So if the affirmative's, well, let's take one step back. If we're going to read a position, an advantage about the economy, we need to say whether the economy is doing good or bad now. And for the affirmative, in theory, since we're going to argue that we want to change the world, we want to describe it as bad. But we don't just have to say currently it's bad. We could argue that maybe in 6 months it will be bad or it will be worse in some way, right? So both of those would be considered uniqueness. A link is a description of the action taken in the affirmative's plan. So we don't explain the consequences of the plan, right? None of the outcomes of the plan. We just say, what is the plan itself? What does the plan do? Now, I want to be clear here, whether you're the negative or the affirmative, so obviously the affirmative reads the plan, whether you're the negative or the affirmative, if you're reading a disadvantage or an advantage, the link is still to the affirmative's plan happening. If you're the negative, you don't want to get tripped up and say, the plan doesn't happen. That's not how links work. That brings us to the next 2 parts of the uniqueness model, which are internal link and impact. And internal links are explanations of how the link, the plan, changes the uniqueness, which is the status quo. I always tell my students, think story, right? Think the story of what the plan changes. And then finally, for the uniqueness model, we have an impact, which, again, we've said this a million times, is mostly how debates get evaluated, is who's winning control of the most important impact in the debate. And impacts are why the change created by the plan matter. That brings us to counterplans. A counterplan is a fiated advocacy or opportunity cost put forth by the negative. Now, in my mind, counterplans are advocacies. In some minds, they're opportunity costs. And an opportunity cost is not just a debate term, but a real world thing. And it's the idea that doing something means we can't do some other thing. So let's talk about counterplan, refutation. This is kind of a weird thing. I divided this section up a little bit odd. I changed my mind on where certain things should be put. But basically here, we're talking about types of counterplans, just for the record. So, plan inclusive counterplan, or a PIC as it is sometimes called, is a counterplan which does less than the entirety of the plan. So if the plan is Paul should get a cat and a dog and a gecko, the counterplan, if it's a plan inclusive counterplan, could be Paul should get a dog and a gecko. And you can see there that I didn't include a cat as part of that. And so the point behind this is to avoid permutations, something we'll talk about in a minute, because it's impossible to get both a cat, a dog, and a gecko, and to only get a dog and a gecko. Then we have delay counterplans. Delay counterplans is kind of a cheater thing, but it's where you basically say, we're going to do the plan, but at a later date, right? So do it after the presidential election. Do it after this specific UN summit, etc., etc. More counterplan types. Consult counterplan. It's a counterplan which steals the affirmative, but premises the plan on only occurring after genuine prior binding consultation with another actor. So if the plan is we invade Russia or whatever, the counterplan is we consult NATO about whether to invade Russia, and we only do it if they say yes. And then you'll read say yes arguments. You'll say like why NATO would say yes to doing that. Then we have alternative actor counterplans, which are also called alt actor counterplans, and that is just arguing that another actor should do the plan. So instead of the United States, Russia. Instead of the Department of Homeland Security, the United States military, etc. That brings us to contention model terminology. So all of that was about policy style debate, right? Now we're back in value debate. The contention model has 3 parts, as I indicated when I talked about contentions earlier. And those are claim, warrant, and implication. A claim is a statement a debater intends to prove to their audience. So, example, there are wolves nearby. And then warrant is the evidence and logical support for the claim. And so I might say, I hear howling, right? And the logical part is that wolves are animals that howl. I don't have to explain that necessarily. It could be an implicit or explicit warrant. Implicit is where you don't explain the warrant. You just assume people know it. Explicit is where you do. And then the implication here is why the claim being true matters. And so it matters because if there are wolves nearby, I don't want to be nearby anymore because wolves are scary. The last thing that can sometimes happen, especially in value debate, is on top of reading a claim, warrant, and implication, you can want to read a tieback. A tieback is how your contention functions, meets, or otherwise supports your framework for evaluating the round. That's the value and value criterion, right? So you read a value about athleticism. You said we know who's the most athletic by who can bench press the most. You would then need to explain why your position, your contention specifically, meets that value criterion slash value. That brings us to theory terminology. Theory. Theory arguments are theoretical objections to how an argument, to how an argument is being made or how an opponent is debating, right? So this is essentially the way you're debating. You know what? Let's just change the actual definition for posterity's sake, because whatever. I'm probably going to publish this. Direction 2 in arguments. There we go. Or how an opponent is debating. Sweet. Sorry to I have to disrupt that for that, folks, but this one seems relatively important. Theory is a theoretical objection to an argument or how an opponent is debating, and so that means either the kind of argument you made or how you made the argument was a bad thing, and we'll talk about a bunch of different types here in just a second. A priori is something we say in theory debate on the voter level. Again, something we'll talk about. And it essentially argues that a theory argument should be considered prior to the consideration of the substance debate. So basically what I'm saying is if I win my theory position, it doesn't matter if you win all of the advantage and disadvantage, counterplan, plan, etc. debate, because this is a gateway issue, right? You can't decide that part of the debate until you've already made a decision on this part of the debate. That brings us to the structure of theory arguments, and all theory arguments have the same 4-part structure. Part 1 is the interpretation. This is the rule that a debater or team suggests ought be observed in a debate. So this could look like interpretation, debaters can't talk fast, or interpretation, debaters cannot read conditional advocacy, something we'll talk about in just a bit. I want to make a note here. That's why there's this asterisk. In the case of topicality, it's read so commonly that instead of offering a interpretation where you would say like part 1, debaters should have to defend the topic, we kind of skip that step and we just go straight to offering a definition. So we say interpretation. The army is one of the branches of the United States military characterized by blah, 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 blah. So once we have an interpretation, we then have a violation, which is an argument that explains how a team has failed to meet the interpretation. Essentially, this is the link into your theory shell. The next 2 parts are standards, which are also called reasons to prefer, and then voters. So standards are arguments for why an interpretation is preferable to another. These function as internal links to the voters. Then we have the voters themselves, which are the reasons that violating the interpretation results in a ballot for the team reading the position. This generally includes fairness and education. So now that we know about this fairness and education thing, let's talk about the standards again. Standards on things like topicality is usually like the negative is saying something along the lines of limits. Limits are good. It's good to limit the other team because it makes the debate more predictable, it lets us engage, and that's good for fairness and education. And the affirmative team instead is probably going to say something along the lines of like creativity. It's really good for us to be able to be creative, and that's better for fairness and education. If we were talking about conditionality, and again, we'll be defining all these things in just a bit, the affirmative team who is reading conditionality is going to say something along the lines of it makes the member of government speech too hard, and the negative is going to say it's good for a debate to be hard, or it's good for us to be able to test the affirmative however we want. And you have to tie those things into essentially how do those produce fair and educational debates. So, what are the most common theory arguments? The big 3 for sure are topicality, trichotomy, and conditionality. So, what is topicality? It is a theory argument suggesting the affirmative has failed to meet their stock issue burden of topicality. You're not talking about the resolution as it was intended. A good example from like 10 years ago when Sasan was debating is there was this topic that was something about like increasing regulations on banks, and the affirmative team defined it as riverbanks. We're going to do like riverbanks, not banking institutions. Probably not topical. Trichotomy. Trichotomy is a theory argument suggesting that there are 3 styles of debate, fact, value, and policy, and that the affirmative has written a case for the wrong style. So this is a policy topic and you've defended it as a value, or this is a value topic and you've defended it as a fact. Then we have conditionality, and when we say conditionality or when we say condo, because that's how it gets abbreviated a lot of the time, what we're really saying is conditionality is bad. And so this is a theory argument suggesting that the negative should have to defend counter advocacies for the entirety of the debate, that they shouldn't be able to remove those positions. Arguments have been made and responded to. That brings us to topicality continued. So there's technically like two kinds of topicality that aren't just standard topicality, and those are extra topicality and effects topicality. So extra topicality, which is sometimes abbreviated to extra T or extra T without the E, because it saves you a whole letter, is an argument that the affirmative team has affirmed the topic, but has gone beyond that, right? So maybe your plan does increase the minimum wage, but it does it via a new tax on cigarettes. And that's extra topical because it lies beyond the bounds of the resolution. And the reason it's problematic is because obviously you could now read positions on why increasing the price of cigarettes discourages smoking, and that smoking is bad. And smoking is bad. Don't smoke. You're stupid if you smoke and you're a small child. If you're an adult and you smoke, I also do think you're kind of dumb, but that's kind of up to you. Anyway, effects topicality, also called FX topicality or FXT, is an argument that the direct action of the plan is not topical, but that through its effect, it ultimately results in a topical action occurring. So maybe you don't increase the minimum wage, but you do something that, because that happens, will then result in the minimum wage being raised. So like, let's pretend the current president doesn't want to increase the minimum wage, but the vice president really does. So your plan is like, we're going to get rid of the president, and then the vice president will become the president, and since they support the minimum wage, they'll get it done. Framework. Framework is a theory argument similar to T, but intended to also limit out critiques. It typically objects not only to a definition, but to a fundamental premise of how debates ought to occur. And so topicality just says, like, you got to defend the topic, like you're defining one of the words in the resolution wrong. Framework is you're not only not defending the topic, but you're not defending fiat, or you're not defending any actor whatsoever, etc., etc. That brings us to conditionality continued. I'll move myself over here so it's out of the way. When it comes to conditionality, there are three kinds of statuses for advocacies, essentially. So the first one is being unconditional, which means that you will maintain an advocacy for the duration of the debate. It means there is no condition under which you can remove it from the debate. So if someone reads a turn on your counterplan, you better answer it or you're going to lose. There's being conditional, which is arguing, and that's the wrong there. There are conditions under which the negative can remove their advocacy. That's the right there from the debate unilaterally, right? So conditionality means that pretty much for any reason I want at any point, I can remove the counterplan from the debate and everything you read on it will disappear. Lastly, there's dispositional. And I have a note here. People disagree on this. This is the, I would say, most commonly accepted definition of dispositionality. On the next slide, we'll be talking about how I define it. And like, whatever, if you disagree, that's cool. That's why I put this one first. Dispositionality is arguing that the negative can remove an advocacy from the debate if a permutation or theory not about the status of the negative advocacy is read. So if they read something other than conditionality, any other theory, then we can kick it. This is like a whole weird thing. I'll talk about it on my slide. Let's just go ahead and go there. So, dispositionality, Paul's version, is arguing that the negative can remove their advocacies from the debate with a specified condition, generally one that the affirmative can choose to trigger. So, technically, I think that dispo just is condo, so whatever. But since there is some kind of delineation, I guess my point here is that what they're trying to get at when they say dispositionality is, yes, there's a condition, but it is one that is specified as opposed to just arbitrary and the negative can do it whenever. And so what it really comes down to is the difference between af choice and neg choice. Conditionality says the negative chooses when to remove positions and can do it whenever they want. Dispositionality, in my opinion, is just when you establish some condition that the affirmative can trigger of their own volition in order to remove the position from the debate, which solves for a lot of the offense about why Kondo was bad, because now the MG is not as hard. That brings us to less common theory, vagueness, also called alternative vagueness, which is arguing that the alternative of a critique is too vague to be debated. Maybe someone says, imagine yourself as a work of art, and you're like, I have no idea what that means. It doesn't mean anything. It's silly, and you didn't explain it. It's dumb. I don't like it. Specification, and there's a bunch of these, so we'll talk about those in a second, is arguing that a debater / team should have to further specify some element of their case, generally something about the plan text. So what could that look like? There is agent of action specification, which is called A-spec, which is arguing that advocacies must specify who authorizes them. If it says the United States federal government, do you defend Congress? Do you defend the president? Do you defend the Department of Education, etc., etc.? Agent of enforcement specification, which is called E-spec, arguing that advocacies must specify who enforces them. So there's a difference between the agent who passes the law, the agent of action, and the agent who actually has to enforce it. Is that the EPA? Is that the police, etc., etc.? Then there is funding specification, which is F-spec, arguing that the funding mechanism for an advocacy must be specified or may not be specified. So you have to tell us how you'll fund your plan, or you did tell us and you shouldn't be allowed to do that. That brings us to overspecification, which is called O-spec, which is arguing that a debater or team has specified too much and therefore has hindered their ability to be debated. So for example, if like the resolution is about some environmental thing and they specify the agent of action as like some specific dude in the Environmental Protection Agency, and then they read advantages about why that dude's really awesome and why it's so good to have them do it. And like, how could we debate that? We're not going to find that in our prep. It skews out our links. Okay, then there's disclosure theory, which is arguing that debaters / teams must disclose the cases they have previously read or are about to read ahead of time. So usually what this looks like is if you've read this case before, you should have had to post it to some kind of online accessible platform. Usually we call these wikis, so that we can look at your case. Then we get to mechanisms for evaluating theory, and there's only two, which are competing interpretations and reasonability. Competing interpretations is arguing that theory should be evaluated based purely on analysis of the flow through the offense-defense paradigm. So that means like whoever's winning, like if a robot evaluated this debate, who's winning at the end when they add up all the arguments? Then there's reasonability, which is arguing that if the judge thinks the team responding to theory has reasonably met the interpretation or counter-interpretation, that they can / should not vote the team responding to theory down. So like if you thought I was topical, then we're probably good here. If you think that even though I don't meet their definition, I like almost do, then we're good here. That brings us to refutation terminology. So we'll start with the button responses. Sasan has a video on this. Feel free to check it out. First is no brink, arguing that the specific size of the link is insufficient to result in the impact. So we're not saying that war can't trigger our impact. We're saying that the war you're describing is insufficient to do it. Non-unique, arguing that either the impact already exists in the status quo or that the internal link to the impact is already occurring in the status quo. So if the impact is economic collapse and the economy has already collapsed, that impact is non-unique. Link turn, arguing that the link's direction relative to the impact goes the other way. So if they say the plan increases the economy, you would say the plan actually hurts the economy. That brings us to the second half of button, impact turn, arguing that the impact ought to be characterized in the opposite direction. So if they say economic collapse is bad, you say economic collapse is good. Outweighs, arguing that your impact generically outweighs your opponent, it just matters more for whatever reason. And then finally, no link, arguing there is no connection between the plan and the impact. So there's no reason why our plan happening would result in the impact you're claiming. Refutation continued, impact defense and thumpers. Impact defense is arguing that the impact itself does not matter or mitigating its effectiveness. So if they have a nuclear war impact, you just read like 7 reasons why a nuclear war doesn't matter, will never happen, etc. And then there's thumpers, which are link uniqueness arguments, generally prepared ahead of time that suggest something similar to the plan should have or will soon trigger the impact. So if their link is Democrats passing laws means they have to like horse trade with Republicans and Republicans get to do whatever they want. If you can read like 5 Democrat policies that are about to happen, those thump the link. The link goes away because there's other things that are going to cause that same thing to happen. That brings us to link differential and uniqueness overwhelms the link. Link differential is just arguing that there is a meaningful difference between the way two things link to the same impact. So maybe we're capitalist and you're capitalist, but you're definitely more capitalist than we are. There's a meaningful differential in our links. Then there is uniqueness overwhelms the link, which can be confusing with no brink, and sometimes I almost feel they're the same, so I don't know, but it is arguing that the uniqueness is situated so firmly in the other direction that the link is insufficient to overcome the status quo. So to me, no brink is like, well, something could change this, but yours isn't the right size. This is kind of saying like things are so overwhelmingly bad that nothing you do is going to matter. Counterplan refutation, permutations and competition. A permutation is testing the competitiveness of the counter advocacy by arguing that doing the plan and some percentage of the counter plan is both legitimate and net beneficial. So if we can do our plan and some portion of the counter plan or the entirety of the counter plan, and if doing those two things is better than just doing the counter plan, then we should win. Your counter plan is not an opportunity cost. Essentially, permutations are testing the link to whether or not a counter advocacy is an opportunity cost to the affirmatives plan. Competition is arguing that the counter plan is desirable / the perm is incomprehensible or illegitimate. So this is where you read arguments about why they don't get their perm. Competition continued. There's 2 kinds of competition. Textual competition, which is sometimes called text comp, and functional competition. Textual competition is arguing that a counterplan is an opportunity cost as long as it has a different text regardless of functional differences. So for instance, this happens a lot in Taiwan debates. We've been guilty of this for sure, like me and Dallas, I don't know, 6 years ago or something. And we had a debate about Taiwan, and basically it's like, okay, their plan is Taiwan should do X, and our counter plan is the Republic of China should do X, and those are the same thing functionally, but we use different words, and we talk about why using one of those words is good and one of those words is bad. Then there's functional competition, which is arguing that a counter plan or counter advocacy is an opportunity cost only if its implementation functionally differs from the plan. So it's not enough to have the text be different. What you do needs to actually be different in its results and effects. More counterplan refutation, severance and intrinsic. So this is how you answer permutations potentially. You could say that it is a severance permutation, which is arguing that the permutation severs some part of the affirmative advocacy or the affirmative representations. So if the example earlier, Paul gets a cat, dog, and gecko. Counterplan, Paul gets a dog and gecko. If the permutation was Paul gets a dog and gecko, you're like, wait a minute, you're severing out of the cat thing. That's not legitimate. Then there are intrinsic permutations, which is arguing that the permutation includes elements which are not part of the plan or the counter advocacy. So, plan, dog, cat, gecko. Counterplan, dog, gecko. Permutation, dog, cat, gecko, alpaca. That wasn't in the plan or the counterplan. Impact calculus terminology. Impact calculus itself is the comparison of impacts. So, what are the big 3 of impact calculus? Magnitude, probability, and time frame. Magnitude is arguing that an impact is greater in size or severity, whether qualitatively or quantitatively, than another impact. Our impact is bigger, it matters more. Probability, arguing that an impact is more likely to occur than another. And time frame, arguing that an impact will occur on a faster time frame than another impact. So ours will happen sooner, and that's why it matters more. The smaller 2, not the big 3. Reversibility and sequencing. Reversibility is arguing that an impact matters more because once it occurs, it cannot be done. So once someone's dead, they can't be undeaded. Sequencing is arguing that an impact matters more because it occurring will result in the impact it is being compared with also occurring. So what does that mean? It means that if I'm reading an econ impact and they're reading a war impact, I can say the economy sequences war. When the economy gets worse, that increases the likelihood of your impact happening. So prioritize mine. That brings us to critiques, criticisms, structure, terminology. So, critique structure. Critiques, generally speaking, have 4 parts, sometimes 5. First part is framework, which is establishing how the debate ought to be evaluated, right? Evaluate this through the lens of historical materialism or something of that nature. You're essentially trying to... The way I explain this to people is it's like shining a spotlight on a stage. So, on the stage, picture this metaphor. On the stage, in red, someone has written, Paul wins. If I shine a yellow spotlight on that, you can still see Paul wins. But if I shine a red spotlight on that, it looks like it disappears because they're the same color and you can no longer see it. Framework is like shining a spotlight that makes certain arguments disappear. And would you believe it, it's always the other team's and not yours. Links basically the same, so it's how the other team's arguments or debating causes the impact of the critique. I only mention this because obviously when you read a disadvantage, it's always a link to the plan, but sometimes links on Ks are not about the plan, it's about representations, justifications, etc. Impacts I don't define because they're just the impacts of the critique. Same thing going on here as it was on advantages and disadvantages. But then we get to the alternative, which is an advocacy of a critique. It is the advocacy statement of the critique, which may or may not specify an actor/action and may or may not defend fiat, and that is intended to solve for the critique's impacts and to avoid the links, right? So it's essentially the counterplan associated with a critique. Critiques are interesting because they're usually done in 4 parts and potentially on 4 separate sheets of paper, but it's one holistic position. So it's kind of different than a dissat and a counterplan, but for all intents and purposes, it is a dissat and a counterplan. So that brings us to critique structure, optional / more specific. There is a thesis and a roll of the ballot. So a thesis is a summary statement of the fundamental argument being made by the critique, right? So you explain your K in 1 sentence for the judge or for the other team. And a roll of the ballot, sometimes called an ROB, is a top-level framework argument that establishes the procedural or comparative means of determining who should win the round. So the roll of the ballot is to vote for the team that best disrupts capitalism. The roll of the ballot is to vote for the team that best promotes accessibility. That brings us to critique literature terminology. This section is not going to have definitions. I'm just going to put up a bunch of names of critiques and like nicknames of critiques, and then you can Google them if you want to, because I'm just trying to provide a resource in case you don't know what those words mean. This will kind of help you find a literature base for them. Not going to read them all. Let me get this out of your way, though. Whatever. I'll read them all. Who cares? Capitalism, which is sometimes called CAP or Marx or ML or MLM. ML stands for Marxist-Leninist. MLM stands for Marxist-Leninist-Maoist. Neoliberalism, sometimes called neolib. Afro-pessimism, called Afropass. Afrofuturism. Ableism/disableism. Sinology, this is like critiques of the Western view of Asia. Also sometimes called Orientalism, like of Edward Said. Anyway, securitization, the security K, terror talk, Deleuze and Guattari, which is called D&G, Baudrillard, terms like hyperreal, simulation and simulacra, and semiotics, and then feminist international relations, which is FemIR. Second page, psychoanalysis, usually associated with Lacan and a few others. Nihilism, associated with Nietzsche. Nietzsche is also associated with the eternal recurrence and ressentiment. Death denialism, associated with Ernest Becker and terror management theory. The Borders K, associated with a lot of people, but Gloria Anzaldúa comes to mind. Reproductive futurism, associated with Edelman. Hauntology. Settler colonialism, which is also called Setcall. Anthropocentrism, which is also called Anthro. And deep ecology and eco-managerialism, sort of environmental critiques. Again, you can look all these things up. I'm just providing names so that you're aware of them, and maybe you just want to research some literature bases, and here you go. So that brings us to general debate terminology / jargon, which I hope is the final section. So we have jargon, constructive and rebuttal. So constructives are speeches in the debate, generally at the beginning, where new arguments are allowed to be made, so you read your cases for the first time. And rebuttals are speeches in the debate where new arguments are disallowed unless it is a debater / team's first chance to respond. So if a team in the speech right before your final speech, which is almost always a rebuttal, makes a new argument, of course you're allowed to respond, but otherwise you can't make a new argument that hasn't been mentioned. Then there is the negative block and collapsing. So the negative block, also called the block or the neg block, is a period in certain formats of debate where a team, generally the negative, has two back-to-back speeches. This happens in parley with the member of opposition and the leader of opposition speech, or leader of opposition rebuttal speech, so the MO and the LOR. Also happens in policy debate. Then there is the collapse, which is to remove other positions from the debate in order to focus on what you believe you are winning. I just did a comprehensive video on how to collapse. If you want more information on that, go ahead and look there. Then we have an overview and an underview. Overviews are a summary offered at the beginning of a speech or before a specific position in the debate. So maybe you start your PMR or your MO by being like, overview, judge, you're voting for us on this kind of thing. And then there's the underview, which is the opposite, right? It's a summary offered at the end of a speech or at the end of a specific position in the debate. On case versus off case. I'm shocked at how many people don't understand this even in open. On case is indicating arguments will be made on the affirmative team's case. The case is the affirmative. So when they say on, it's on the affirmative's case. And then off case, indicating arguments will be made that do not occur on the affirmative's case. So disads, theory, etc. Case. Moving myself once again. Spreading, D-developments, and roadmap. So spreading is an abbreviation of speed reading, which is a rapid delivery style used in competitive debate. D-development, also called D-dev, is taking an action that would fundamentally disrupt the economy in order to save the environment. So basically, like we say, collapse the global economy because otherwise climate change is going to kill us. A roadmap is indicating the order that a debater will address arguments in their speech. I think this is the last slide. I'm really hoping it is. It's been so long. Try or die is a framing claim suggesting the judge has to vote for an advocacy because the status quo is so terrible and the negative has not offered a counter advocacy. So basically you're saying like things are so bad that if there's any risk the plan solves, that's a reason to vote for the AF. Let me move my picture again. Here we go. I knew we'd make this work. Independent voting issues, also called IVIs. Suggesting an argument rises to the level of deciding the decision on its own. So it's an independent voting issue. You were racist. It's an independent voting issue for being sexist, etc. Then there are reverse voting issues, RVIs, which is arguing that rather than a team winning the debate if they win a position, generally on theory, that they should instead lose if they lose that position. So normally, topicality and other theory arguments are like a no-lose opportunity for the other team because they are necessary but insufficient burdens, as we described at the beginning. So if you are the negative and you win topicality, you win the debate. But if you're the negative and you lose topicality just goes away. The other team doesn't win because they've proven they're topical. But an RVI says, yes, we should win because we've proven we're topical. Oh my gosh, that was the last slide. So that's like every debate term I could think of to name that seemed worth naming and useful to debaters, folks. There might be some that I left out, and I apologize if that's the case. And if I went too fast for you, sorry about that too. Just wanted to get through it, and obviously you can just pause when you need to pause. Thanks so much again for watching, and Streak stays alive.